We are going to talk today about scaling behavior, something we don't want to ignore at your peril. And to do that, we're going to do a little quick behavioral exercise. So what I'd like to have happen is, because everybody in the room, please stand up for me. Up on your feet, my friends. Thank you. And what I want to have happen is you're up, you're limbering, you were seeing that keynote sitting down for a while. What I want to have happen is everybody on the sides, I want you to filter into the front because I don't want to work that hard. All right, so if you guys can come over, move into the front, you guys come over, file in with these folks, lots of seats. That way I can really work this space and share some really awesome stuff with you guys. We're going to move quickly. We're going to talk all about scaling behavior. I realize that I am the last person between you and a cocktail, so I'm going to do my absolute best to make sure that this is a high-energy chat where we get lots of good stuff out of it. So, as was said earlier, I'm Andrew Quinn. By day, I run the training operation here at HubSpot. Do lots of cool stuff in helping scale the business from a behavioral standpoint. I can't stand standing on the stage, so we're going to move around a lot. But by night, what's interesting is I actually do this. I play guitar in an 80s hair metal cover band. We're going to be playing tomorrow night as part of the Inbound cocktail party. Who saw this last year at the Inbound party? Yeah, it's quite a thing to see. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to do so. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to cover these four things. We're going to talk about the hidden scaling problem. We're going to get into what does it actually mean to scale behavior. There's four fundamental models that we use from a leadership perspective to drive scale. And then how do we actually put those models to work? So let's talk a little bit about this hidden scaling problem. So when we talk about building a business, right, we're trying to scale our model, make that all happen, we talk a lot about the math, right? There's a lot of stuff going on relative to the ARPU, the cost of customer acquisition, the LTV, all those kinds of figures go into what our model is going to be and how it's going to function. There's also a lot of effort put into the mechanics of the model. How is this thing actually going to work? What are all the processes? What are all the structures? What are all the interconnectivity in the business in order to get the outputs that we want in that whole organization? What's often left to chance, though, is this. So I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think are the behaviors? What are behaviors that drive scale? Like, what are those behaviors? What's that? System adoption, sure, that's a big one. What else? When you think about the people in your organization. It's funny, when I ask this question, I get this kind of thing a lot, because a lot of this stuff is left up to chance. It's the messy part. It's the people part. How do I get the people to do the things that I need to do consistently over time to get the outcomes that I need in my business? And it's one of the things we've actually been very deliberate about at HubSpot is how do we actually scale the behavioral parts of things? How do we set the organization up in a way that people want to do the kinds of things that we need them to do repeatedly, consistently over time? I'm going to walk you through how, as leaders in the business, we've managed to do this. So what does it actually mean to scale behavior? It really boils down to this. It's not leaving to chance those behaviors necessary to scale. That happens in a lot of businesses. We leave that stuff to chance. We see this a lot in our sales organization. We used to see it. We would give some people a particular approach they wanted to take. We would coach them on the sales messages they would deliver. And then over time, we would place this person next to Bob, say, go learn from Bob. And what happened is the sales message would start to drift, right? And the value points that we all came up with start to change. So what we want to do is create mechanisms where we cannot leave those behaviors to chance. Because here's the thing you need to think about. As a leader in your business, you are being watched. The team takes their behavioral cues from you. They're deciding how does this operation work. They figure out what are the things I can do, what are the changes I can incorporate that are tolerated, what are the things that I absolutely have to do or I get in trouble. They look for that stuff. So as a leader, how do I present the right environment so that I can actually get the scaling to happen, given the fact that they're all watching me? So I want you to think about something here. We've got a couple of different things that can happen relative to what we want to have as outcomes. One is we can have accurate outcomes, but they're not necessarily consistent. People know what they're supposed to do, they have it accurate, but they don't necessarily do it right. Another outcome you get is this. They're deadly accurate, they're just really off base. They're not accurate. They're consistent about it, I should say. They're consistent in where they're going, just not accurate. The other situation is this, not accurate, not consistent. They're firing all over the place. That's going to cause scaling problems. What you need is this. You need people that are being accurate to execute the things you need them to execute, and they're doing it consistently over time. So the question becomes, how do we actually make that happen? Because these behaviors that you're exhibiting are the building blocks of the culture of your company. That's what really make it up. Culture is not beer taps and nap rooms and all that kind of cool stuff that we have. It's actually the behaviors that people exhibit in the way they relate to each other, relate to the customers, relate to prospects, and getting things accomplished. So I'm going to get right into the foundational models that scale behavior that you as leaders can draw on to drive that in your business. So they are DISC, Situational Leadership, Coaching by Asking, and SBI Feedback. Let's get into the first one, into DISC. How many of you guys know what DISC is? Anybody know what that is? Cool. It's like a behavioral model setup. It's not that dissimilar from Myers-Briggs, from Insights, from the Platinum Rule. Tony Alessandra's here. He's going to speak about the Platinum Rule. They're all fairly similar things. We've chosen to rely on DISC. What's interesting about DISC is, as a leader, if I provide these assessments across my entire organization, I start to understand the behaviors that people draw on in order to get things done in my business. And when we look at this in a bit of a deeper way, the DISC wheel actually breaks down into 12 styles. There's D, I, S, and C, but then there's a sub-style associated with each one of those. When you look at the north and south, that's how people approach getting things done. Do people do it in a fast, bold, and actionable way, or do they do it in a more stable, calm, methodical way? And then the east and west poles, those are how they approach relationships. Are people collaborative and empathetic, or are they actually challenging, logic-focused in that type of an approach and how they get things accomplished? And then the ones you see in the corners, those are the way in which they go about doing those things. So if I'm going to establish a relationship and I'm also going to get something done and I'm going to be enthusiastic about it, I'm going to be somewhere within that range. And the more I understand this about each other in the organization, like as a leader understand who's got what styles, what's my style, I start to understand the way people are going to interpret the behaviors I need them to execute. You guys follow me on that? So when you think about the DISC model that we use coming from Wiley, it gives this dot setup. So what that's really an indication of is the degree of dominance that that particular behavioral set presents for that individual. So the closer it is to the center, the more slight that particular behavior dominance is. The farther out you go, the stronger that is. So if we look at around the wheel and somebody uses a D, if they're all the way out on the edge, they tend to be very challenging individuals that are very action-oriented. They drive for results. That's what they're like. The more slight it goes in, the more that they're there, but they're not overly aggressive in that particular approach. So when we think about this dot placement, what that starts to help us understand is, what are these people like? So these come from actual reports that we use. And what's interesting here, when we look at some of the things that are exuded by people in this particular style, a D style, we can see they have an ability to achieve results. They need to win. They like win or lose situations. They can become impatient or demanding. But when we look at some of the variations in this and we see something like the DI, it tends to change now. It's quick action, new opportunities, confidence and influence, impatience, egotism, manipulation come into play. When we look at the DI, a little bit of variation there. We get people that have high standards. They're determined. They're overly critical about things. So even in that one style, you see a lot of variance in the way that somebody goes about doing what they need to do. So when we put that all together and we start looking at one particular example of like how they behave under pressure, you start to see some people become impatient and demanding when they're under pressure. Others become overly critical when they're under pressure. And when you're in a high growth organization, that's one of the areas where you're going to see a lot of behavioral variance start to come to play as you're trying to get consistency in your organization. So one of the things that we rely on heavily is this understanding of styles across the business, because it allows us to really understand who's going to react how relative to the types of things we need them to do. Because ultimately, when you boil it down, why this matters to scaling behavior, I'm moving backwards, is that it provides this visibility into the behavioral drivers your team members are going to lean on when they're executing your business model processes. So that's the first thing. What are the things that people are going to draw on as they're trying to execute those things that matter to you in your business? So that's an informed approach that we take, trying to understand where people are coming from. The next thing we get into is this thing called situational leadership. Anybody familiar with situational leadership? Far fewer on that front. This is a model, comes out of the Blanchard organization. So let's say we've got 4 people that work for us. We've got the person who's getting the job done. We've got another one who's got an attitude problem. We've got somebody who's crushing it. And we've got somebody else who's a new hire that just joined. Not really sure where they're coming from. And what we tend to do as managers is label individuals. We look at this person and say, yep, that person's crushing it. Yep, that person's getting it done. That person's got a bit of an issue. What's interesting here is let's look at the person who's getting the job done. Let's look at some of the things this person might have to do in order to execute the different tasks we have for them in the job. They could have things like communicating progress, prioritizing tasks, managing time. You can see all those up there. And the fact of the matter is they may be better or worse at any one of those particular behavior types. They might be great at communicating progress. They might be okay at prioritizing tasks. They might be really crappy at meeting their deadlines. So in situational leadership, what's interesting here is it starts to look at not the individual as a label, but rather, how do I label all of the different goals and tasks this person has and their ability to execute them? And one of the keys here is trying to diagnose the person's ability to execute that goal and task. So when we have somebody, we give them a brand new task. Whether they've done it before, we want to think of them as a beginner when we first start. And they may move through to where they become a learner, and people tend to be frustrated when they're learning things. That can happen because they're starting to realize it's harder than I thought. Eventually, they become capable at that particular goal or task, and then ultimately they can go beyond what they thought was possible, and they become an achiever. So when we think about this setup and we start applying this to our individual, what happens here is I start looking at this person and going, all right, communicating progress. They're a D4 on that. They're in a point where they can actually achieve well. I know that. They do an excellent job. They communicate effectively. They're really good at that. But I look at some of the other tasks they have, like prioritizing tasks. They just learned how to do that. They just got a whole new set of tasks. They're learning how to prioritize those. They're a beginner at that, let's say. So I'd have to treat them differently in the way in which I try to lead them. Managing tasks, perhaps they're capable at that. I might label them again as a D3, a capable performer. As a manager, when I start unpacking the individual and thinking about them as the collection of goals and tasks they need to achieve, the collection of behaviors they need to exhibit in order to drive the outcomes that I need, I start realizing I have to give them different things from a leadership perspective to get the outcomes that I want. So what happens here in this model is it starts to run based on support and direction. So you have direction on one axis, you have support on the other axis. So when we look at direction, essentially what's happening there is when somebody's brand new at something, or I'm doing a leadership style that's an S1 style, I'm basically deciding what I want them to do. There's another style here which is a combination of direction and support. That's when I'm going to decide what's going to happen, but we're going to talk about it first. I want to understand how you're feeling about it. In an S3 style, we're going to talk about it, but you're ultimately going to decide what you're going to do. And then an S4 is a delegative style. I'm going to delegate to this particular individual on that particular goal or task. So when we start to think about how this model actually works, what's happening here is as I diagnose the individual and I say, all right, this particular person who's just learning how to do, let's say, task prioritization, I need to be very clear on the direction I give them. Give them a lot of direction. They don't need a lot of support because they're brand new at it. They want all that direction. In another area where they might be struggling, they're learning how to do that, I need to give them the time to tell me what they're experiencing, what are they feeling, what's happening with that, and then give them the way forward, give them that direction. As they progress and somebody becomes capable at something, I start to back off a little bit. But I give them the room to tell me what's happening, I engage a lot, I try to help them solve their own problems. And then ultimately, when they master that particular goal or task, I can back off entirely and wipe my hands of it. So let me ask you a question. A manager who spends the majority of their time in an S1 style, what kind of manager is that? What do you think? Really small. Micromanager, exactly. That's exactly the type of manager that is, a micromanager. What about somebody who's on the exact opposite end of things? They're an S4 all the time. What's that? Detached, exactly. Detached, they delegate, they're like, don't worry about it. Talk to me in a month, go make it happen. The problem with both of those, obviously, when I have a detached approach, the odds are they're going to go running down a road in a direction they think is right. I'm going to realize it's wrong and I have to back them up. And that is no fun for you and it's no fun for them. Likewise, if I'm constantly micromanaging, I find myself in a situation where I'm going to have to always make decisions for them and ultimately I can stifle their ability to be effective in my organization. And I don't want that to happen. So we rely a lot on situational leadership as a method for helping managers break themselves out of a typical set of patterns that most new managers do. In our organization, we do a lot of promote from within. So the majority of our managers have never managed before. They need to learn how to become more flexible, and situational leadership allows that to happen. It's a model that I've used in my professional career for a very long time. It's highly effective at helping you understand how to give people the right direction and support relative to what they have to accomplish. So when we look at our gentleman here, and we have a situation where he's a D4 and I'm giving an S4 style versus a D2 relative to meeting deadlines and giving that S2 style, I'm able to use all this in a way that I can provide the right level of direction support to ensure the goals and tasks drive the right behaviors. So if you think what we're at right now, we've talked about how do I understand the way people relate to the things they need to do. Now I'm focused on what are the leadership behaviors I need to demonstrate at a particular point in time in order to get the right outcomes from them relative to the goals and tasks they have to accomplish. Next question goes, well, how do I do that? Because I'm going to have to coach them through. And there's been a lot of talk here at the conference about coaching, things along those lines. So let's talk about a coaching by asking model. Now, a lot of people, when they look at the situational leadership model, they wonder, where does coaching fit? And it fits in the S3 and S2 quadrants. That's when you do a lot of coaching, because that's when there's a lot of support. There's a lot of conversation happening at that time. So when we think about coaching, a lot of people think about coaching in terms of coaching by example. Let me show you how to do that. Let me watch you execute, and then I will correct on how that happens. And that's very important when somebody is in, let's say, a D1 or a D2. They're learning how to do something, and we're helping them understand how to do that. But once they go beyond that, if I keep coaching by example, I'm going to end up stifling them. I'm going to end up making them reliant on me to solve their own issues, which isn't advantageous to me or to my organization. So what you need to do is move to a coaching by asking model. And this one comes from a book called Sales Coaching by Linda Richardson. I would highly encourage you guys buy this book and read it. It's highly adaptable to any kind of coaching that you need to do inside your organization, and I'll walk you through really quickly how the model works. Basically, it's 5 steps. It's this connect and clarify, compare perceptions, consider obstacles, construct to remove them, and then ultimately commit to action. So what does that actually mean? It means the following. When I am opening up, basically what I'm trying to do is set some neutral rapport. So you and I, we've been working on a particular project, and what I thought we'd do is just put that whole thing on the table. Let's kick it around. Let's figure out ways that you can move forward to be more successful at it. And you kind of look at that and go, okay, that's cool. I'm not being evaluated. I'm not being judged in that moment. We're actually going to work this thing through. And we set that rapport up. And the next thing that happens is they talk first. That's the key in this whole thing. And it's what a lot of us as leaders forget to do. We talk first because we want to solve the problem for them. We want to move on. We want to get it rolling. But the fact of the matter is it actually creates more of a time suck for us. Because the more I solve their problems, the more they rely on me to solve those problems, the less they can stand on their own 2 feet. And in HubSpot, what we need are people that can stand on their own 2 feet, be independent, be effective relative to the things we need them to do. So in this model, the first thing is I want to understand what's their point of view of the thing they're wrestling with. What is their perception of the situation they're trying to solve? I want them to talk about it first. And then I'll add in my perceptions of what I see going on. And I'm always doing that in a neutral and open way. From there, we'll check for agreement. Do we both agree that these are all the things that are involved in the situation? Next question we get into would be, all right, so tell me more about what do you think's getting in your way of actually moving forward on this particular thing? What are the blockers? What are the things that prevent you from successfully moving forward? Again, they talk first. They share what they think is in their way. I encourage them to go a little farther, think more. Then I offer my perspectives on what they could do to move forward. Then we check for agreement on that. Next question becomes, well, how would you actually solve that? What do you think you should do to get that blocker out of your way? This is a really important sequence. What a lot of managers will do is they'll ask what the situation is. They might ask what the block is, and they'll immediately go, you should just do this. Just do this, do that, fix this, fix that, and it'll be fine. And what happens is that will quickly solve it in the moment, but who actually owns that solution? You do. You want them to own that solution, and the more you take a little patience and help them solve their own problem, they own it in a much stronger way, and they end up able to carry that forward and lay it onto other situations that are similar and solve those as well independently. So the real trick here is making sure you talk first when you're trying to understand their perceptions of the situation they're involved in, when you try to understand the obstacles they feel are in the way to completing a particular goal or task they're trying to do, and then what they think are their steps forward to correct it, and then you add in your expertise to help do that, and then get them to commit to action. When you run it in that particular way, what happens is they end up owning the outcome relative to the coaching moment you're trying to have. And I found this to, again, be extremely effective. And what's interesting now, if you think about where we're at, if I understand where this person is coming from a stylistic standpoint. If they're an S, I might coach them in a slightly different way than if they were a D in the way I might use my language. And if I thought about where they were relative to that D2 to D3 in situational leadership, it would adjust the degree to which I provide the solution. Because what's interesting here, when I look at the situational leadership model, when I'm moving from an S1 to an S2, I'm going to be coaching by example. It's a new task. They don't know what it is. I need to show them what a good job looks like. I need to make sure they're clear on what expectations are. I need to make sure they understand how we're going to measure what's going to happen. But as they start to move along that range from D1 to D2 to D3 to D4, I need to start shifting my coaching style. And when I get to the point where they start getting into that D2, what I'm doing is I'm using the first 3 steps of that coaching model. I want to understand set my neutral rapport. I want to understand their perception. I want to understand what they feel is in their way. And I'm trying to decide in that moment, can they solve their own problem? And if they can, I want to encourage them to do so. If they can't, I want to then provide them the way forward, and that helps me diagnose clearly they're still in that D2 range, which means I need to, in a point where I'm providing a lot of guidance and a lot of support, but I'm not providing the answer. I'm providing the answer, but I'm also doing that in a supportive way. And then as they move to that D3 where they're capable, I start relying on them to solve their problems, to where they ultimately become independent, and I can move into an S4 style where it's basically, let me know when you need me. And as I move along that continuum consistently over time, I'm able to build very independent people. But what's interesting, when I give somebody new, or I should say when somebody who's working for me gets a new goal or task, I give them a new goal or task, you always have to treat it as a D1. You start that way. Because if I look at it and I say, all right, I don't know how much transferable knowledge and skill you bring to this particular task, so I want to make sure that at the very least you're very clear on what we're trying to do, how we're going to measure it, what I believe a good job looks like, and I can determine very quickly, do you bring any transferable knowledge and skill to that game to do that particular task? Is there any demonstrated knowledge and skill that you possess that I can also witness and say, yeah, you can do this? And you could move from a D1 to a D3 or a D4 in an hour. There's other goals or tasks could take you 6 months. And as a leader, I'm trying to gauge that and understand how can I move them along that continuum so that I can ultimately manage down to 0 on my matrix. Very powerful model, very useful in helping build independent people inside an organization when you apply the coaching. So when you're using the right coaching approach, this lets you develop people that can stand on their own 2 feet, as we've talked about, and that's important. Which brings us to the last model, which is feedback. So we use a mechanism in HubSpot called SBI, because basically feedback, in Dharmesh's words and Brian's words, the breakfast of champions. We highly believe in that. But what's interesting is, for a lot of managers, they don't like to give feedback because it's hard, it's emotional. There's been a lot of talk about emotions in the workplace so far today. That plays a big role. And a lot of times, we don't necessarily want to give the hard feedback we should because it's going to be conflict-laden, or we fear that it might be. At the same time, people on the receiving end rarely believe they get feedback they can actually use, and there's lots of studies you can read about the effectiveness of feedback. And ultimately, a lot of people will tell you that they don't get feedback they can actually use. A lot of times I get, hey, you know what? You're doing a great job, just keep doing it. Or you need to get really better at that thing. You're way too aggressive in the way that you approach customers. You got to dial that down in some way. People can't use that, can't act on that. So ultimately, when you think about feedback as well in organizations, a lot of times it comes to this type of a situation. The performance review, we use that as the feedback mechanism. And for a lot of organizations, that's the only time people get feedback. And that's not very effective because a lot of time has passed between when they had things occur and the feedback that might be written on that document. No one likes to have that happen. The way I think about feedback and the way we think about it inside HubSpot is like this. If you think about a device like a Fitbit, That's giving you feedback all the time on how many steps I've taken, how much activity I've had. The same thing needs to happen for the people that are executing the behaviors that you need inside your business. They need some sort of mechanism to be providing them feedback on a consistent basis in a way that they can use. So with that said, we do this thing called SBI. Comes from the Center for Creative Leadership. It's basically called Situation, Behavior, and Impact. And what it is, it's a very specific way to deliver the feedback statements. And what you want to do is you want to state very clearly the situation at hand. When I saw you in that particular meeting, I noticed that you seemed very uptight. You were tense when you were delivering your numbers. It was delivered in such a way that our CEO was very much questioning the validity of what you were talking about. He started to really wonder whether or not you actually had the insights that you claimed to have relative to what was happening. And as I was watching that unfold, I also noticed that several people in the room also seemed to be reacting in a less than favorable way because of the body language you were exhibiting. And what that effect had on me was that it made me wonder how confident you are in the numbers that you're talking about. It made me start to wonder how clear you are on the types of things you need to communicate. When I deliver feedback that clearly illustrates the situation, clearly illustrates the behavior, and clearly illustrates the impact of that behavior on me, that sets me up in a strong situation for that feedback to be actionable and to be received in the way in which I intend. So we train everybody in HubSpot on the management side of things, as well as emerging leaders in the business, how to do this. So they're able to provide clear and effective feedback to their peers, to the people that report to them, so that the feedback they receive can be actionable, it can be timely, and it can be effective. So there's lots of documentation on the Center for Creative Leadership on how to do this kind of thing. I'd highly encourage you to acquire that as well. Very, very effective. So with that said, deliberate feedback is important to scaling behavior because, as you can see here, it ensures that it drives the behaviors necessary to scale. That's what we want. We're trying to increase that likelihood that the feedback is going to be effective. So when we put this all together, what's really starting to happen here is you have the DISC model. So I start to understand, all right, the person that I'm working with, this person that's reporting to me, what is their behavioral style? How do they approach things? Are they a hard-driving D that's really driven towards action and results? Are they somebody who's a bit more on the supportive side because they're an S, stability matters to them, they want to be very collaborative? I'm going to have to change the way I think about approaching that individual. Let's say when I'm an S1 style, I've given somebody a new task, they're a D1 relative to that particular goal or task. It's brand new to them, which means I'm going to be an S1 style. It means I'm going to decide, I'm going to direct them on what to do. But the way in which I communicate that, I need to bring flexibility to bear. Because if I'm providing that direction to someone who's a D, and I do it in a very light-handed way, I was really thinking, I need you to be a bit more focused in the way that you're driving that particular customer relationship. I think you could be a lot stronger in how you do X, Y, and Z. And the D's like, get to the point. Just tell me what it is you want me to do. And if they're in that D1 point, my S1 style needs to be very clear. Here's what I need you to do. I need you to do X, I need you to do Y, I need you to do Z. Here's the timing it needs to happen. Here's how I want to make sure we report back on how that's going to occur. If I've got somebody who's more on the S side of things, I might take a softer approach on that. Likewise, if I'm doing the coaching, I'm going to adjust my language based on the type of individual that I'm talking to and where they are stylistically. That also plays a big role in the feedback. The SBI model will work for any style, but the way in which I make my word choice associated with somebody who's coming, let's say, from an I style, they're highly enthusiastic, they're highly collaborative, they want to take quick action, but I need to be very deliberate about the things that I need them to do. I need to be very clear in my language, and I also need to be very upbeat. I need to make sure that person feels heard in the things that they're talking about. So DISC becomes an interesting model that fits inside each one of those leadership squares, because they sit here and look at, all right, if I'm in S1 style, who am I dealing with, a D, I, S, or C, or a combination? How does that shape my direction? If I'm in an S3 style, where I'm doing a lot of coaching, I'm doing a lot of coaching by asking, letting that person decide, it's going to shape the way I ask my questions, whether they're a D, an I, or S, or a C. And then ultimately, through all of this, I need to be providing feedback consistently over time so that they understand the progress they're making across that whole continuum from D1 to D2 to D3 to D4. And then I'm providing that feedback in a way that is effective for them to actually adjust in the behaviors. Now, this is something that we've been doing now for quite a few years at HubSpot, and we've seen a considerable consistency in execution. How many of you guys are HubSpot customers? So I'm willing to bet from customer to customer, if you talk to each other about your experience with your salesperson, about your experience with your onboarding consultant, about your experience with your customer success manager, those experiences are going to be remarkably similar from individual to individual. And I'll even argue that when you talk to your salesperson, compared to your implementation specialist, compared to your customer success manager, there's consistency throughout the stories they're all telling. And the reason being is because as a leadership organization, we're relying on these things to ensure there is not a lot of variability, but the individuals are cared for in the way that they're going to bring their special stuff into doing those particular tasks, executing those particular behaviors consistently in the business. And these, in a lot of respects, as I'm standing here talking to you, like they're squishy things, right? They're soft skill things, but they have such a huge impact on our ability to actually get consistent behaviors out of the people that work for us. And a lot of times when we don't focus in ways that help people adopt the behaviors we need and they understand why they're doing them and the importance to the business, you end up getting drift in the business. And you end up getting inconsistencies from person to person to person, which then ends up creating erosion of value in the organization and ability to execute. So there's some key things I want you to think about here in this whole list. You guys can certainly read it faster than I could ever speak it. But I want you to really walk away from here thinking about how you approach the behavioral development of the people that are in your organizations, whether it's 10 people or 10,000 people. You need to be really diligent about the way in which the behaviors you need them to execute are introduced to them, are coached, and feedback is provided against them over time so you get the outcomes that you need. So with that, I want to remind you, go to Inbound Rocks because it'll be fun. And I'm willing to take any questions you guys have across these leadership frameworks and how we apply them and how you might apply them in your business. Go for it. Do you want to use the mic or do you want to just go for it? Yeah, there are free disc programs that you can use. There are also ones that are paid for. We use the paid for one. It's basically, I think it's $45 a report, which is pretty short money. But what I will say is that it's highly detailed. The question was, can you get free disc stuff or can you pay for it? What's interesting is it's the most actionable version I've seen, the Wiley version. It gives a 20-page report, gives you highly detailed action steps you can take in your style, working with other styles. I also run a DISC manager course with all managers, how to actually use DISC in motivating, directing, developing, delegating, prioritizing, time decisions. It's become a real fabric of the business, actually, in helping people think about how to connect to others. And it's been a real way to sort of stop siloing in the business and people steamrolling others and all that kind of stuff. What else? Sure. Yeah, so the question is, how transparent are we relative to somebody's ability to execute relative to a given task? So we're very open with that, very transparent about that. Now, the language wouldn't be, hey, you know what, I think you're a D2 in this whole thing, so I'm going to give you an S2 style. Like, that's not how it works. In language, it would be, this is a fairly new thing that you're doing. I see that you're starting to get frustrated in trying to execute on that. What I'd love to do is hear about the kinds of things that you're wrestling with. What are you bumping up against? And let's see, is it something you can solve on your own, or is it something that you need me to give you some of my expertise? Like if I was in your shoes, what would you want me, if I was in your shoes, here's what I'd do to solve it. Like, it's that kind of language, which is a D2, S2 language, where I'm indicating, I understand that you're learning this, I understand that there's frustration, I want to hear what those things are, and then I want to help you see, can you solve your own problem, or do you need me to give you the way forward? And there's a lot of clarity around that. Now, a lot of people in the business have been trained on the model, so they know what it is, but we don't use that language. Like, you're an S2, I'm a D2 kind of thing. Make sense? Cool. What else? Go for it.
So I manage a lot of people, which means that I don't have a chance to give situational feedback evenly across the board. So how would you handle that if that's a primary way of giving feedback?
Do you have other peers that are further along than those individuals that can provide feedback for them? Like, is there ways that you can start scaling and building the bench of leadership because you have other people on your team that are good at those things and you can apply them to be sort of peer mentors and leaders to those? We do a lot of that, and that works really effectively in our organization.
That could take care of some of it, although, we're in a growth stage, so
Sure.
it may not, happen evenly even if we wanted to. Are there other ways that you find out how people are doing or give feedback, or, when you do your annual review, what do you look at?
Yeah, so, we do a couple of different things. One is some of the organizations use Tiny Pulse, if you're familiar with that. That is
Is that like Big Brother?
how to describe it? It's a feedback mechanism that's anonymous, but it allows people to say what's on their minds.
A la Amazon?
So it comes in that way. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Another one is 15.5, which a lot of our engineering organization uses, and it takes 15 minutes for the person to talk about the things they're dealing with. It takes you 5 minutes to go through and understand what's going on. So it provides ways for you to get feedback back to them through that mechanism, which is a bit asynchronous rather than having to take your time to do that. So there are definitely tools in that way. Personally, I've always leaned on finding the time, whether it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes, spread over the week to touch everybody and try to give that feedback personally. But I know it's difficult.
Those tools that you mentioned, do employees feel that it's valuable to them?
Yes. And it's only used in those organizations where the employees feel that it is useful to them. So not every department uses it. We very rarely mandate anything across the organization. It's department by department. They decide how they want to handle that type of circumstance. Sure. Good to see you again.
How do you think, or do you think automation relates to scalability when we're talking about soft skills?
What kind of automation?
When I think scalability, I think we need to be able to handle more than humanly possible. And so in terms of scaling, a lot of companies who are experiencing super growth, in order to integrate this kind of relationship development with all their players who are multiplying, is it possible to automate some of these systems where we're able to deliver this information?
Sure. I'm not sure, because I think that starts to dehumanize it, and I think that's risky. So the question becomes, how do you do this in an efficient way? And part of that is realizing that these aren't 1 hour, hour and a half conversations. Like some of these things, they're 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, 7 minutes there. It's like checking your Fitbit, right? You do that, and it's happening continuously over time. These mechanisms operate that way. It's not like I'm going to sit down and now I'm doing situational leadership with you and that's going to happen for an hour. It's more like I'm doing it all the time, and I'm looking for ways in which they're operating against their goals and tasks, and I'm thinking about when I can give quick feedback. I'm thinking about when I can give quick coaching conversations and help them develop to where they become independent and can stand on their own 2 feet. I find those things very hard to automate. I'm not sure how you'd actually do that without taking the human element out of it, which is so vital to creating the kind of culture that you want to drive the behaviors that you need.
Thank you.
That's my, please. Absolutely, yeah. Because when they reach that, like if you think about the grid, it's basically managing to 0, right? And if they're completely independent and a self-reliant achiever on that particular goal or task, it really is now on them to come forward relative to the things that they need to have happen. Now, I still will provide some feedback over time, but it's a lot less than somebody who's in a D1 on something else. But the important thing to realize is there's a lot of time where a single individual is a D1 in one thing and a D4 in something else. So that's recently happened to me. I have somebody on my team. They were an individual contributor, delivering sales training, effective at it, great at it. Now their team is scaled. They now have 2 people reporting to them. And in that reporting relationship, they've never managed anybody before. So they're back to a D1 relative to leading other people, still an S4 or D4 relative to all of the execution of a sales training program. But I have to switch my style for those other tasks now. Because if I treat her as I do relative to those things she's great at, to those things she's new at, I'm going to cause frustration for her. And I can't do that. I have to be flexible, or she's going to end up getting frustrated, which I don't want to have happen. And that's going to end up creating behaviors that aren't going to help me scale faster. Yes?
Can you speak to how this would dovetail into a situation in which you have massive change management, such as my company has gone almost overnight from 12,000 to 22,000, and trying to scale behavior across a whole
Sure.
new group of people?
That's a tricky problem.
Yeah, it's a big question.
And personally, I haven't really experienced that, so I don't know that I can give you a salient answer on that. What I will say is it starts with each individual, right? So it starts with the leadership team deciding what are those behaviors we want, what are those behaviors we're going to carry forward, how are we going to hold people accountable to them, and how do I ensure that I can ramp them into those? Because if you think about that whole D1 to D4 thing, I've got all these new people. Do they all know how to do those things that I have? And how am I going to bring them from one step to the other? And if everybody agrees that, yep, we're going to have to be very consistent in how we ramp them up, it can actually work quite effectively in that way, but they all have to kind of buy in at the leadership level that here's how we're going to do it. Because sometimes just, hey, go do it this way, you're going to get 1,000 different ways that it's going to happen, unless somebody's coaching them through it. Cool.
So we're small startup, about 1.5 years old, and what I'm running into now is the kind of direct report dilemma, if you will. We're like 8 people, so it's like in between now where do I need to start bringing on managers to, manage the 9th, 10th, and 11th persons, so because I can't give them the TLC that they require to manage them effectively. So knowing what we said here today,
Sure.
How do I implement this for us as we scale?
So I think part of that is, in the organization that you have, do you have somebody that's prepared to step up and be a leader? Or does it have to be somebody from the outside?
Yeah, I've definitely been grooming. I don't think everyone's there yet culturally, just given all the growing pains that going on. But managerially, we're not quite there yet, so which kind of makes me be extremely cautious.
Because part of that is looking at, can I start to delegate certain elements of that leadership element to those individuals and see how they handle it, right? I give them a new task, and that new task might be, what I need you now to do is I want you to work with so-and-so and so-and-so. They're fairly new. I want you to be the one responsible for ramping them up into those particular elements. So not managing them, but they're sort of leading them relative to a better outcome than what they're getting now. And that takes less time for you. It also starts to give them an opportunity to demonstrate are they capable of that. Because obviously you have a risk. If I bring in somebody from the outside as a manager, I'm going to have to make sure that person's going to square philosophically with what we're trying to do. Because that's an option too, but that brings risk in as well.
So to follow that up, when it comes to knowing, okay, this person, when it comes to their ability to, support a customer, they might be a D4. But when it comes to their ability to, effectively present something to management, they're a D1. So when it comes to me as a manager and keeping up with all of these employees and their respective Ds.
Sure.
Is there a system that can help me monitor all of that, or just got to keep a lot of mental Post-it notes, or?
I mean, part of that is what you first need to think about is what are the major goals and tasks this person has, because you can get exhaustive, right? You can get down to the nitty-gritty on that, and that's going to defeat its purpose. So it's like, what are the core things here that are the goals and tasks this person has, and where do I think they are on that scale? And drawing up a simple grid of just, here's the goals and tasks, and D4, D2, D3, D2, D1, like moving across, because the model, if you think about it, works from right to left, because as they move forward, you basically manage down to 0 relative to those things. So if I set up my grid going that way, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I just put check boxes next to all those things where they are, I can get a quick visual snapshot of where are they, what type of leadership style do they need from me. It doesn't take any more extra time, it just takes more flexibility in how you end up relating to them relative to where they are and their ability to do those things.
Awesome.
So just a simple like graph like that can go a long way in helping you be more clear around the types of leadership behaviors I want to bring to bear on a given goal or task. Cool. How many? We're done. Apparently we're done. I'm sorry, sir. But thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of Inbound.